Hi, this is Dr. Mike Chupp, and you are listening to CMDA Matters, the weekly podcast of the Christian Medical and Dental Associations. On our episode this week, I am joined by psychiatrist and author Dr. Curt Thompson. Back in 2021, Curt released a new book called The Soul of Desire. After reading it, I asked him to come join me on the podcast today to share with our listeners about how our desire for spiritual connection with God, as well as deeper connections with each other, can lead us to living more fully integrated and connected lives. So let's listen in to my recent conversation with Dr. Curt Thompson. Well, today on CMDA Matters, I am delighted to have psychiatrist Dr. Curt Thompson with us. He has written a book entitled The Soul of Desire, Discovering the Neuroscience of Longing, Beauty, and Community from Ivy Press in 2021. He's a graduate of Wright State University as an MD, board-certified psychiatrist, and the founder of the organization called Being Known. They develop resources for hope and healing. That's part of our vision statement at CMDA, at the intersection of neuroscience and Christian spiritual formation. He's also the author of a couple of other books, The Soul of Shame and The Anatomy of the Soul. Dr. Thompson and his wife, Phyllis, who's a licensed clinical social worker, are the parents of two children, and they live in Arlington, Virginia. So welcome today, Dr. Curt Thompson.
Oh, Mike, it's such a pleasure to be here. Thanks so much for hosting me. It's great to be here.
Your three published works, they help us as believers, especially those of us in healthcare, understand some aspects of the human soul. And clearly a psychiatrist, especially a Christian psychiatrist, would want to have a great deal of insight. And I think you can help us understand a little bit better today, and our listeners, the soul. So tell us about this progression of the books that you've written, The Anatomy of the Soul, The Soul of Shame, and now The Soul of Desire.
Right. I think, Mike, without knowing that this is what was about to happen, I think inadvertently these first three books that I've written became kind of an arc, a three-part series without me knowing that that's what was intended. The first book, Anatomy of the Soul, is really an exploration of what does it mean for us to be human beings from a biblical perspective, from the anthropology side of the Bible, and how does what we're learning about the brain and relationships in this field of interpersonal neurobiology that we'll probably talk about, how does that better inform us? How does that highlight things that we are already seeing that the biblical narrative tells us to be true about who we are? I think one of the things that we find is that in our world, 400 to 500 years now, in the wake of the emergence of modernity and our capacity to think about God as only in the non-material world, right? I mean, and what science has kind of done is pushed God to the margin, and we are left preaching from pulpits, talking about things in ways that are just kind of abstract. And so we can talk about Paul's theology, we can talk about the gospel, but does that have impact literally on what I'm sensing and imaging and feeling and thinking and so forth? And one of the things that we're also reminded in Romans chapter 1, verse 20, is that from the beginning, people have known from the creation. God has used the creation to give people an impression of his nature and his power. And neuroscience is an important part of that created order. And what we're discovering is that when we look at these interacting parts of the way the brain and relationships work, that picture points us and supports and reflects on what the gospel and what the Hebrew Bible has told us from the beginning. And so that first book was really an invitation for people to allow neuroscience to provide a fresh invitation, a fresh picture, and a fresh experience of what the gospel has been saying all along. It's not a substitute for the gospel. We would say it is God's use of his world to tell even more in a more accentuated way. What does it mean for us to be human, and what is God's vision for us to be people of beauty and goodness? The second book, The Soul of Shame, came along in the wake of this because I think that as we read in the first 2 pages of the Bible, that we were made as people who were designed to steward the earth and to become objects of beauty and goodness as we also steward a world that's in the same way. And then something goes terribly wrong. We get to the 3rd page of the Bible, and we discover that evil tends to wield shame as one of its primary tools, if you will, to disintegrate the world, to devour the world. And so that book is an attempt to explore the place that shame plays, the role that it plays in our lives as evil tries to wield it, not to suggest that shame is only or ever bad, but our response to it is something that continues to get us into trouble. And then out of that work came this question of how often do we find ourselves, and the scripture is replete with commentary about shame, bringing it up together with sin. And then what does it mean for us to respond to that fully? And what we come to discover is that you can tell me till the cows come home, as a surgeon would like to be able to tell his patient, do this, do that. It's going to be fine. It's not going to be fine. All the things that we physicians like to do. We like to be able to just tell people. We like to know that we know that we know. And we come to discover that when shame walks into the room, you'd like to say to someone, look, Jesus has forgiven you. You don't have to be ashamed. And the problem with this is that the part of my brain that hears you tell me I don't have to be ashamed often has very little to do with the part of my brain that's actually experiencing the shame. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that we discover is that when we then start to look at this question, again, going back to the first and second pages of the Bible, we come to see that the way our minds operate is in this way, that we are fundamentally people of desire. And we are people of desire because that is who God is. If we are made in God's image, on the first page of the Bible, God says, let us make mankind. It's not just automatic. He has a reflective moment, and let's do this. There is desire spilling onto the page. And then we are made as people who are like God. But what do we desire? We desire to be deeply known, and then we desire to go on to create beauty and goodness in the world. And this is where the exploration of beauty becomes a powerful response to shame, as God then, even in his Son, we would say, kind of turns upside down even our notion of what it means, even for beauty itself, to be redeemed through Good Friday and Easter.
So for the soul of desire and that desire for beauty out of shame and sin, you focus on a particular scripture throughout your book, The Soul of Desire, and it's Psalm 27:4, so I thought I would just read it briefly for our listeners. One thing I have asked from the Lord, that I shall seek, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to behold the beauty of the Lord and to meditate in his temple. So how does this passage relate, bringing these topics together, and the neuroscience specifically of longing, beauty, and community?
One of the first things that we recognize when a newborn comes into the world is that we are creatures of desire. Newborns are just sponges. Like they demand things. They want things. And at first it's all physical appetites. It's comfort, it's food, it's nourishment. It's all of these things. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to see that from the very beginning, we are people of desire. And this doesn't stop. This longing for who we are, this longing for the vision and the gaze of the other to look upon us with love. I mean, who doesn't want to walk in the room and see your friends see you and say, Mike, you're here, and to sense their longing for you to be with them and for them to be with you. This is inherent in who we are. And the challenge is, of course, that because of our trauma and because of our shame, our desires, our longings get bent. They get directed in ways that only continue to reinforce our traumas, reinforce our shame. This is what we would say was taking place on the third page of the Bible in Genesis chapter 3, where the serpent takes advantage of the longing, and she looked and saw that the tree was good for all these things. And so we are people of desire, and this desire is, of course, a function of the brain. It's a function of attachment patterns, like the child who's looking across the room, longing for mom's approval as he wanders away, the toddler, and then coming back, and then wanders away, and then comes back. This longing for beauty and goodness is inherent in our basic neurobiology. But we have these challenges, and so when we are going to become these people of beauty and goodness, we would say, like, well, how do we do this? And the verse in Psalm 27 helps us in this, helps frame this, because the first thing that we see is that he has this deep, persistent longing. There's one thing that I'm gonna do. And he's going to be committed. He's going to persevere. There is one thing to be committed. Like if you're going to go to med school, like dude, like you got to be committed. Mm-hmm. If you're going to do much, if you're going to be a parent, you've got to be committed. And so this notion that the writer is longing and committed to his longing, this one thing, I will dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life. We now have data that would indicate that if you are 35 years of age or younger in our country, by the time you reach retirement, you will have had up to 40 jobs. There's not a lot of dwelling going on in that regard. Mm-hmm. There's not a lot of opportunity for us to be with a community of people long enough for my soul to be known deeply enough. Like we can't survive, let alone flourish, living as if life is just a McDonald's drive-through. And so if I'm going to dwell, I can then dwell in the house of the Lord. And by this, we don't just mean a building. We don't just mean going to Sunday school. We just mean Sunday worship. We're talking about being in a community of people by whom we are deeply known in order for us to gaze upon the beauty of the Lord. And what is that? It's easy for us to imagine things that are naturally beautiful, the sunset, the nature scenes, a beautiful person, a beautiful symphony, a beautiful piece of art. The thing about the gospel that is different than any other story that we're going to read about in the world is that God looks at carnage. And that's not what he sees. He looks at carnage. He looks at his own son on Good Friday, and he sees Easter coming.
Praise God.
And so when we talk about being in communities, we're talking about allowing others to see the carnage of our lives in order for somebody else to see the beauty that's emerging that I can't see, because I've been working so hard to make sure that you don't see the carnage. But this is what Jesus is about. He comes to Peter in John 21, and he's looking for carnage, right? He says, "Do you love me?" And the question is not, do you love me? The question is, are we going to get this stone turned over where your shame still is hiding out? Mm-hmm. This shame that you still carry about having thrown me under the bus 6 weeks ago?
Right, right.
And so this mission of gazing, of course, again, we're not glancing, we're gazing. This takes time. And then this leads to communities that are enabled to meditate, and other translations would suggest inquire of the Lord. It allows us to ask the important questions. Where are you? Do you love me? Can you drink the cup? These questions of what do you want? All these questions that God is longing to ask of us, and not as our teacher who's giving us an exam, but as our Father who's longing to bring us up into these places of beauty and goodness, and to do so not only through our giftings, but not least of which being through the places about us that we feel we would just as easily want to send to the trash heap.
Well, Curt, I got excited reading through your book, and certainly I was aware that psychiatrists do group therapy. But to see that from your perspective as confessional community, and in medicine, I found that maybe my son was a ranger in the Army. It's only the military that I think that has more acronyms than we do in medicine. But you introduced me to a new psychiatry acronym, IPNB, Interpersonal Neurobiology. Can you explain that to our listeners just in a nutshell, what that means?
Yeah. My friend and colleague, Dan Siegel, now more than 20 years ago by far, he's a psychiatrist, Harvard trained, and was on the faculty at UCLA. And he's really was asking the question, because myself as well, I went to medical school, I went to a psychiatric residency training program. And in those 8 years, I did not have one lecture, let alone one course on what is the mind. Mm. You're a surgeon, I'm sure you've done Whipple experience, you know what the GI tract is. You know this. Yes. You know what you're going for. Imagine psychiatrists who don't really yet have a working definition of the mind. And one of the things that Dan really wanted to explore was the question of, there are a lot of people who have a stake A lot of people, a lot of scientific disciplines that have a stake in this. This question of what is the mind and what is a mind that is flourishing. And so after looking at a lot of these different things, the question of like, what do they have in common? And this notion of interpersonal neurobiology really is this field of science that looks at the nature of the mind from the perspective of how it really seems to emerge. And we know then that it is an embodied and relational process. We have a definition, an embodied and relational process that emerges from within and between brains, whose task is to regulate the flow of energy and information. That's a fancy schmancy definition. But boiled down, we're really saying that this is a field that studies the interaction between the brain and relationships and the mind, and what does it mean for that mind to flourish.
I think I've heard it referred to often as soft science, medical science, as it referred to maybe the orthopedic surgeries that I did, very hard medical science. In your book, you talked about parts of the brain that deal with being here and with others. Some of that was quite new to me. Certainly, I don't remember being taught that in medical school, that parts of the brain have to deal with that, whether it's hippocampus or frontal lobe. So explain, how is that proven that a particular area of the brain has to do with this interpersonal neurobiology?
Well, a lot of these studies come, I mean, as is the case for much of medicine, we discover things based on experiences that we have with patients who have particular pathologies. Like we learn things about how to do certain surgical interventions because somebody's got a problem, though we got to go look at it.
Yeah.
And so, for instance, when you have stroke patients in which you take out the left half of the brain, you find that people will report experiences in which they will report to you that they don't have an awareness of the passage of time, for instance. Not only do they not have an easy access to their language centers because Wernicke's area has now been kind of shut off with the stroke, but they also have this felt sense of being wholly present in the world, this sense of being in the world, this kind of ever-present moment, for example. And we know that, for instance, we talk about a sixth sense that we have. You know, you kind of say that rather casually. Oh, I've got a sixth sense about this. But we actually do talk about a sixth sense, and that sixth sense is coming from the internal organs, from the viscera of the body that runs north, and eventually the dominant feature of that runs to the insula, which is dominantly on the right half of the brain. And I have a sense of what I'm sensing. But then what we have to do, we as human beings, unlike any other animal on the planet, we have language that tells a story. And so what we like to say is that the brain first senses things, and then we are making sense of what we sense. And when you have split brain studies that cut the brain in half, if I can't access my left hemisphere, my language centers, I have a much more difficult time making sense of what I sense. But when I recognize that I'm actually able to put language to things that I feel, we literally have crosstalk in the brain through the corpus callosum. And the brain itself becomes more holistically integrated, more holistically connected to each other. That's just one example of what happens when we are involving more parts of the brain, talking to other parts of the brain that heretofore had been literally cut off from one another. We talk about the hippocampus. We know that there are meditation studies that increase the thickness of the hippocampus. When I meditate for 6 weeks, I can increase the hippocampus by, of course, in brain size. We're measuring these things in, micrometers and millimeters. But there's increased thickness of the hippocampus, which is intimately involved in how I am paying attention both to time travel and to memory. And what I do with memory is important because, as we like to say, there's nothing that you do with intention that is not something you are remembering to do. But what happens when I grow up in a house where I have a fairly brutal experience, and I learn very quickly not to pay attention to certain things because emotionally it's too difficult? I may not have an explicitly remembered capacity to call on that event, but my body remembers a great deal of this. And then I wonder why I'm having panic events when I find myself going home for Christmas because I don't remember certain events explicitly. But when we look at this notion of implicit memory, that tells me a very, very different story. But it's difficult for me to kind of make sense of that and capture that if I'm not having somebody else help me make sense of that. And this is where the work of psychotherapy and the work of these confessional communities, in addition to other kinds of interventions that are helping people become what we would say, literally, the technical term, literally more integrated.
So, not to throw you off course here at all, Curt, but I just want to ask, how frequently do you encourage your one-on-one psychiatry patients to migrate into one of these confessional communities? Is it with most of your patients, a small portion?
The work of the confessional communities has become a cornerstone of the practice that we do, and now it's we've had enough activity with it that we've now had a fair number of requests about how can we export this into other domains of life. Every patient that we see, we are going to be on the lookout to see whether or not that they're going to qualify for, and when they do, how quickly we can get them into a confessional community. Mm-hmm. Because we really do believe that in terms of the pace and depth of change that people long to experience, that you just get a lot more bang for your buck when that's taking place in a community.
More eyes and ears and minds involved, right?
Right. And we don't have the data on this yet, Mike, but I mean, just think about it. Think about the fundamental physics of what it's like to be in a room where you in your head, or me in my mind, I have a story banging around in my head about I'm not good enough, and I grew up in a family where I was reminded of this day in and day out. And now I'm sitting in a room with 6 or 7 other people with whom I'm having a very, very different experience. Remembering that in terms of the physics, even of changing the brain, this is not a matter of, again, I just tell you, you don't have to be ashamed, and you kind of take that in like 1 + 1 is 2. That's not the part of the brain that this message is working on. This is going to require some effort at my remembering the felt, sensed experience of what it was like when I sensed your empathy for me. I'm going to have to go back and practice remembering that. When Jesus in Matthew 28 says, remember all that I've commanded you, he's not just saying, remember the list of commands I've given you. We're talking about like all the experiences to say, do this in remembrance of me. They're not just remembering like a particular abstract act. They're remembering what it's like to sit with him at the table. And so these kinds of processes, actually, we trust, given what we know about the way brains change, we trust that these processes actually have a larger impact on each individual because they're in the context of a community than they would have if they're just sitting with a single individual therapist.
We at CMDA care deeply about flourishing communities of healthcare professionals. I think it's a big part of our work is to support Christians in healthcare who face so much adversity and who, I mean, all of us face shame from our past, and your book points that out in so many different ways. And I love the way, Curt, that you link these confessional communities with Hebrews 12 and a cloud of witnesses. So I'd like to ask you, as you've interacted with other healthcare professionals, whether they are followers of Christ or not, how well do healthcare professionals do at being willing to come together in community and do anything at all that look like these confessional communities?
Well, Mike, it's a great question. You know, this, again, not unlike the books as they were written, it's not like we started this with some grand vision of someday we're gonna form confessional communities and then we're gonna like make them available to people everywhere. But we've become increasingly open to trying to find ways to do this, to make this available. And I would say we've had experience exporting these into business sectors. We've had experience exporting these, especially with pastors who may come the closest to comparing to healthcare providers because of the nature of, first of all, how isolating the work can be, mm-hmm. how they feel like they are where the buck stops. Yes, they have a community of pastors. Yes, we have a community of physicians. But when you're in the office, when you're in the exam room with the patient, like, you know, we all know what it's like to be the physician who feels like I got to have this answer right. I got to know what's going on here. And we're not talking, look, there are a lot of smart people, a lot of physicians in the medical, that like the knowledge base that we have to have in order to perform the tasks we need to perform. That, of course, is part of why we were there. But that's not what creates the worry for us. The problem for us is what happens when my shame attendant comes into the room to remind me that I just don't know enough. It's not just the fact that I don't know enough, it's what that feels like for me when I feel like I should have been able to know this. What happens when we lose patients? Because of and we're wondering why what in the pandemic when we're getting overwhelmed because we entered a profession in which our job was to help people flourish, and when it feels like we're doing everything we can, and as John Foreman wrote, we're losing ground and gaining speed. And so I would say we don't have yet a lot of practice with healthcare professionals in particular, but I would say a healthcare professional community would be the perfect place to establish something like this, because it really gives people the opportunity to be in a place where other healthcare professionals are able to gaze upon us with loving kindness in such a way that all of what I'm carrying that feels overwhelming about what it means to be a physician anymore is something that I am not then going to be carrying by myself. We like to say, look, all anxiety ultimately, from a neurobiological perspective, is grounded in my felt sense of I'm going to be left alone living in a box under a bridge. Distress of that kind is all about, it is not just about the setting, the situation that I am facing. It is about what my brain is already doing, racing ahead, imagining the catastrophic outcome of what is going to happen to me when word gets out that I lost the patient. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's not only about the loss of the patient, but it's always at the end of the day going to ultimately be about how is this going to affect me? And will people want to be around? Will people want to refer patients to me when they hear about this case?
Right. And I'm guessing, Curt, that, well, not guessing, certainly you described that you and your partner coach these groups and prepare them. That clearly there's confidentiality involved. And you ask questions throughout these sessions to help the participants in these small confessional communities. You mentioned gazing upon one another. Does that come naturally for the participants in these confessional communities, or do they have to be taught how to gaze upon one another?
Well, so I'll just real quickly, I'm going to give you an example of an experiment of something that we do when we see married couples. There's this exercise that we will do with these married couples, especially, and it's not always fun for them. And especially if they come in hot, as we like to say, when they come into the office and they're mad because they've just had an argument like in the parking lot about whatever we're dealing. And the experiment is that you have the couple sit facing each other knee to knee. And you have them take a couple of deep breaths. And then you say, I want you to now, for the next 5 minutes, I want you to gaze at the other with love and kindness.
Do they look at you bewildered maybe initially?
Right. So the first 90 seconds, it's really painful. It's really difficult. We're not asking you to stare at the other. We're just asking you to gaze. That's what we do, to gaze with love and kindness. And of course, how do you do this? With a person who, like you're mad, you were just fighting with like 10 minutes ago. Mm-hmm. And here's what happens. It's stunning to watch this happen. For the first 90 seconds or so, it will be very flummoxing and anxiety provoking for them. But we will be with them. And I'll say, like, just breathe. We to settle in. And once they settle in, you will watch the penny drop. You will watch the moment when it happens, when they allow themselves to gaze at around the 2-minute mark. And they will do this for 2 to 3 minutes. And when the 5 minutes are up, they don't want to stop. Because one might ask, when's the last time anyone gazed at you with loving kindness for 5 minutes? Mm-hmm. Like, that's their mission. Their mission is to just look upon you in this way. And so I tell people, look, humans, we're not very good at loving one another. We know this. Just ask the Russians and the Ukrainians. Like, we're not good at loving. But the reason that we're not good at loving one another is before that even, we are even less capable of allowing ourselves to be loved. I can't give what I don't have. The reason I can't love, I can't give, is because I haven't yet been receptive to it, which of course makes sense, because to be open to intimacy, to be open to being loved, to be open to being seen, be gazed upon, means I'm going to have to contend with the memory that is wrapped in my neural network payload of the moments in which intimacy cost me something. Trauma and our shame is all bound up in intimate relationships. And so at the same time that I know that I want you to love me, the very act of you getting closer starts to turn on old remembered neural networks that remind me, whether I'm paying attention to it or not, that this kind of proximity is dangerous. And so we do take time coaching. And this is why it takes time to learn. I mean, think about the rich young ruler in Mark's gospel. It's the only gospel that tells this story in this way, where after they have their first part of their dialogue, the text reads, and Jesus looked at him and loved him.
Wow. Yes, that is powerful.
And what do we see? The ruler, it's not just what Jesus says. The ruler missed the look. How do you miss the look of love coming from Jesus?
And Jesus knew he was going to walk away. I mean, that he wasn't going to follow him, yet he still loved him, even though he knew what was coming.
Right. And I think that this is true for all of us. We all have parts of our lives that are like the rich young ruler, that when Jesus looks at us, it's too much. And I can't see it. I can't look at it, which is why we name these things up front. It's just like, you're going to perform a surgical intervention. You're going to give people a list of the side effects before you do it. Here's the risks. Here's the side effects. We're going to give them a medication. Here's the side effects. And we know that when patients are given a list of the side effects before they take the medicine, when the side effects happen, they're far more likely to continue to take the medicine than if you don't tell them.
Right.
Because what their brain actually hears is not just, oh, yes, I know the fact about the side effect. What their brain most deeply senses is that the physician sees me, cares about me enough to let me know that something untoward might be coming. And it only grounds them even more deeply in trusting their physician. And so we let people know ahead of time, when you enter into this, here's going to be one of the side effects that you might have to encounter. And that is that when people come to gaze upon you, to love you, you might think at first that you're going to like this. There will be parts of it that will be difficult. It's okay. Nobody's leaving the room.
Well, I love this quote from your book. Beauty is God's presence being sensed. And until that is the case, God is only ever an abstraction devoid of any power to transform my life. And David, as the psalmist, he spends so much of his inspired writing desiring there in Psalm 27:4 and in so many other places in the Psalms, desiring to be in the presence of God. And even writes in Psalm 139, which is my 2023 Psalm of the Year that I've been working on, that he cannot escape from God's presence and God's knowledge of him and us. So then I have to ask the question, you have so many of your patients, clients who are not believers, who have no faith at all. So how do you get them to experience the desire of their soul to experience beauty in that context, devoid of any faith in God?
Well, I think it's like anything. Jesus came to a population that ostensibly was very, very religious. And at the same time, he was well aware that they actually weren't all very godly. And so we got plenty of people who are people of faith who aren't nearly as close to God as they think they are. And we have plenty of people who are not people of faith who are actually far closer to Jesus than they're aware of.
Only if we could wake up to that fact.
Yeah. And so as clinicians, we have to always be thinking about what's happening in the room and the reality that the Spirit of God is in the room and at work. And the question that we're asking is not so much, are you a believer or are you not a believer? Have you checked the boxes? Because that's not how the brain works. Right? You got plenty of people who have parents who are technically your dad or your mom. They don't behave like it. In this way, we do believe that God is the source of all beauty. God is the source of all goodness. God is the source of human beings for whom empathy is crucially important. And we believe that when people, whether they're believers or not, are responding to empathically mediated interactions with them, they're responding to the work of the Spirit. Now, they may not think that, but it is my job to be aware that the Spirit is still at work. This is not unlike what happens between parents and their children. There are lots of things that children have no idea about what's going on in their world between them and the parent, but the parent knows. And the parent doesn't expect the child to be able to check certain boxes about a lot of things. The parent's not worried about this. The parent is just knows, oh, this is my child and I'm the parent, and we're going to bring this person along. And I would say that in our work, Mike, this is one of the most humbling aspects of my work is when I do have the opportunity to work with people who are not people of faith, and to, in those moments, do the work that I have to do to be keenly aware of where the Spirit is at work outside of any categories that I want to create. This is not my church. This is the church that Jesus is building.
Right.
It is not I am not the judge of who is and who isn't in the kingdom and who's out of the kingdom. This is only for Jesus to judge. And I have to be aware that there are parts of me that at any given moment don't behave like they really believe that God loves them. And so for me, it's a matter of being consciously and intentionally aware that the categories of whether or not somebody is or is not a Christian, they're not unhelpful, they're not useless, but I have to be aware that they are not the only thing that is in play here in the room. And so our mission is to create space for people every time they leave. They have had the experience of knowing that they've been more deeply loved than they were when they walked in the room. And we do believe that when that kind of a practice continues to be offered to people, believing that Jesus is behind all of this, that when it comes to the declaration of whether or not you're a Jesus follower, that's going to be between them and God. And if we happen to be part of the conduit that allows that to happen, then so be it. And if not, then I'm going to submit that to the sovereignty of God and know that we're doing our part in this person's story.
Well, you told me before we got this interview started that you've done a trilogy now, a book trilogy, but you're not finished yet. Tell our listeners about what's next.
In August, I will have a fourth book that will come out, and the title of it is The Deepest Place, subtitle, Suffering and the Formation of Hope. And it is a interpersonal neurobiological exploration of Romans 5, verses 1 through 5. And the take-home message is this, that to be human is to suffer. There's just no question about it. And we suffer for things that have happened to us. We suffer because of things largely, but a lot of our suffering is because of what we do to ourselves. But then there is also the suffering that comes because we are going to follow Jesus. There is the suffering that comes from putting my unbelief to death, from walking, like it is a painful thing to walk away from my addictions. It is hard for me to not lose my temper when that's what I really want to do. Violence is easy. Peacemaking is Herculean. It is painful. It is hard for me to do. There is a certain suffering that takes place. When we read the book of Hebrews, when we read the 3rd chapter, when we read Jesus learned obedience through suffering. Like, Mike, I got to tell you, that doesn't make any sense to me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It doesn't make any, what the heck? Why, in God's economy, why are we doing this? But we see that the real world, the world that we really occupy, where the Prince of Darkness is still in his panic mode, doing everything he can to devour as much as he can on his way out the door, is a world in which to walk into the light is going to be a painful process. Not because we're stupid, not because we're not working hard enough, not because we don't care enough, but because this is what sin has done to us as a human race. Mm-hmm. And so the process of suffering itself, however, I will say, is also mitigated and mediated to the degree that I sense that I am alone in the world. And this, once again, is where the presence of community changes everything for us. It doesn't keep us from suffering, but it certainly changes the way that we encounter it and allows it to be the thing that God is going to use to turn us into these objects of beauty and goodness that he longs for us to become.
Wow. It really helped me to be motivated to think about gazing upon my Savior. And you'll remember that Jesus said to Thomas after he was risen, because you have seen me and my hands and my side, you have believed. Blessed are those who've not seen me, who will not and yet have believed or will believe. And the vision statement of CMDA a few years ago was transform doctors, transforming the world, and giving our world an image. Paul said to the Corinthians that we are being transformed into his image with ever-increasing glory. And so we are representative. We're ambassadors. Paul said also that we give an image for people to gaze upon as we reflect his glory.
That's right. And I would dare say that image that we give people to gaze upon, I'll speak for myself, that I often think that has to be an image that is perfect. It often has to be an image that has no flaws, has no blemishes. And I think this is the thing, right? To gaze upon Jesus on Good Friday, to be that vulnerable is in the presence of others, to be that honest about the parts of me that I hate the most or the parts of me that are imperfect, is the power that God uses to redeem the world. It's very counterintuitive, but it is the power that God is using to transform people in our practice. I know through CMDA, there's so much that the organization is doing to create this kind of space for people and to support physicians along the way. And I'm just really humbled and honored to be part of this interview today for that purpose.
Well, I've been talking to Dr. Curt Thompson today, whose book, The Soul of Desire, Discovering the Neuroscience of Longing, Beauty, and Community. Well, just this conversation, Curt, has helped me. It's always with a little bit of fear and trepidation that I have a conversation with a psychiatrist, but you have helped alleviate some of that angst today in our conversation. So thank you for joining us.
Thanks be to God. Thank you. It's been an honor.
Well, after my conversation with Dr. Thompson, I couldn't help but reflect on my own experience with what functioned not just as a small group Bible study, but really a confessional community of sorts. We were a group of Christian first and second year med students in our CMDA group at Indiana University. And really, we confessed to one another our sense of inadequacy as M1s, our doubts, our worries that maybe we weren't going to make it through that first semester, that first term of medical school. And then, after recognizing that we were all basically having similar experiences, we then prayed for one another and we encouraged one another during that stressful season of our training years. This conversation also got me thinking about CMDA's Center for Wellbeing and the growing impact it's making for CMDA members around the country and even around the globe. Our Center for Wellbeing helps Christian healthcare professionals align with God, optimize well-being, and maximize our influence. If you find yourself feeling burned out and overwhelmed by your daily demands, please reach out to our team in the Center for Wellbeing. After all, friends, you pour yourself out for others every single day, and this is the place to be refilled. Plus, we've been expanding our services in the center to help meet the greater needs that our members have. In addition to the experienced professional coaches who are available to help you through the opportunities and challenges that you face in healthcare, you can sign up for certified coaching training courses that actually will prepare you with the skills for coaching those in your sphere of influence. We also offer marriage enrichment weekends and retreats for our members to refresh and restore your marriages. Our team can help you walk through the difficult challenge of facing a dreaded malpractice lawsuit. We know this can be a stressful time in your life, and we have a team of doctors who have been right where you are, and they want to help you through the challenges you're facing. And there's more that I just don't even have time to discuss. So be sure to visit cmda.org/wellbeing to learn all about it. Speaking of our Center for Wellbeing, I'm excited to announce the next opportunity to take the impactful 501 Foundations in Coaching course on March 31st and April 1st in a 2-day intensive approach. This course will help equip you to learn the mindset and skills of coaching so that you can help your colleagues out of their burnout and help patients achieve better health outcomes and gain valuable personal communication tools. The course is already half full, so please don't wait to register. It's your last opportunity to take the course before the fall of 2023. You can find out more and register at cmda.org/coaching.
Among all of our various ministries, CMDA's specialty sections give you the unique opportunity to equip, network, and fellowship with colleagues in your specific healthcare specialty. Organized by CMDA members, the sections include the Addiction Medicine section, the Coalition of Christian Nurse Practitioners, the Psychiatry section, and more. You can find the full list of sections at cmda.org/specialty sections. And if you don't see a section for your specialty, new sections are currently under development with CMDA's campus and community ministries. Contact CCM at cmda.org for more information about getting involved or starting a section.
After listening to this discussion with Dr. Thompson, I want to encourage you to check out CMDA's psychiatry section. As one of those specialty sections Jamie just mentioned, the psychiatry section strives to promote fellowship, as well as provide community to support and encourage Christian physicians in the practice of psychiatry as they explore the relationship between their faith and professional practice. They also promote within the church the knowledge and understanding of valid psychiatric approaches to mental health and healing, which are consistent with Christ's redemptive love. If you'd like more information and to get involved, just visit cmda.org/psychiatry. If you'd like more information about Dr. Thompson's work in psychiatry, then be sure to visit CurtThompsonMD.com. That's one word, Curt Thompson MD. Plus, there's a link in our show notes today. You can also purchase your copy of one or all three of his books that he mentioned today on his website. And if you're looking for additional resources, check out the CMDA bookstore. One book that I want to mention to you is a book that we published a couple of years ago entitled Downcast: Biblical and Medical Hope for Depression. With compassion developed from their own personal and clinical experience as psychiatrists, the authors of this book, they tackle the complexities of depression from a multidisciplinary approach. In their thoughtful and practical guide, they weave together scripture with science, theology with cutting-edge scientific research, and the stories of many Christians who have suffered over history to help those with depression find healing. Get your copy today by going to cmda.org/bookstore. And before I close, for the women of CMDA, here's one additional announcement from Jamie for you.
Registration is now open for the 2023 WPDC Annual Conference. It will be held in Hilton Head, South Carolina on September 7th through the 10th. WPDC stands for Women Physicians and Dentists in Christ. This is the perfect opportunity for female healthcare professionals of all ages to connect, engage with one another, and build deep friendships as you find peace in the midst of the busyness of everyday life. For more information and to register, visit cmda.org/WPDC.
Next week, I hope you'll come back and hear my conversation with third-year medical student Ryan Orlando. Ryan and I just happened to attend together the Matthew Bulfin Educational Conference of the American Association of Pro-Life OBGYNs last month. Though a busy third-year student, Ryan has found time to courageously speak up in defense of pregnancy resource centers during a recent student congress of the American Association of Family Practice. I think you'll find his passion for the unborn, coupled with a wise and winsome message to a rather antagonistic congress of students, most inspiring and encouraging. Don't forget, if you want to suggest a future guest on our podcast, you can just email us at cmdamatters@cmda.org. And if you like our podcast, please be sure to give us a 5-star rating and share us on your favorite social media platform. As I close today, let's revisit that key scripture verse from the Soul of Desire that Dr. Thompson mentioned. Psalm 27, verse 4, it says, "One thing I ask from the Lord, this only do I seek, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze upon the beauty of the Lord and to seek him in his temple." We are a people with many desires, And it is good, friends, and God-honoring that we desire to create beauty and goodness in our world, just as God does each and every single day. This week, let's be about our Father's business, and let's create beauty and goodness as we bring the hope and healing of Christ to the world through our daily work in healthcare. That's what matters to CMDA, and CMDA matters. We'll see you next week, friends, God willing.
This podcast has been a production of the Christian Medical and Dental Associations. The opinions expressed by guests on this podcast are not necessarily endorsed by the Christian Medical and Dental Associations. CMDA is a nonpartisan organization that does not endorse political parties or candidates for public office. The views expressed on this podcast reflect judgments regarding principles and values held by CMDA and its members and are not intended to imply endorsement of any political party or candidate.